"You have no rights here anymore. Get out of my house." I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, still wearing the black suit from my son's funeral. The coffin had been lowered into the ground less than 3 hours ago, and the person who said that was my daughter-in-law, Linda. I didn't argue or beg. I quietly bent down, picked up my car keys, and did something she would never have expected. My name is Albert Mitchell. I'm 62 years old. And that afternoon, standing in the family room of the mountain home I'd helped my son, Carl, build, I had just lost the only reason I still had to wake up every morning. My boy was gone, a rare cancer, aggressive and unforgiving. The doctors called it terminal. I just called it a thief. Carl didn't want to die in a hospital. He said he wanted to see the mountains every morning, to hear the wind through the pines instead of machines beeping. I stayed here for the last 6 months of his life, sleeping on a pull-out couch in his home office, waking up every time he coughed or called my name in half-conscious whispers. I remember the day I taught Carl to use a level. He was 8 years old, standing on a milk crate in my garage, trying to hang a birdhouse we'd built together. "Dad, how do you know if it's straight?" he asked, his small hands gripping the yellow bubble level. I showed him how the bubble had to sit perfectly between the lines. "Construction is about precision, son. If the foundation isn't level, everything else will be crooked." He nodded seriously, adjusting that birdhouse until the bubble sat dead center. That's who Carl was, never satisfied until everything was exactly right. I sold my stake in Mitchell Construction, the company I'd built from nothing over 35 years. Sold it without hesitation, transferred every penny of my $600,000 into a partnership agreement with Carl's expanding business, all because of one weak phone call from my son. "Dad, I need you as my business partner. I don't want to do this alone anymore." That was enough. I didn't ask another question. The partnership wasn't just about money. Carl had designed it so I'd have 60% voting control while he maintained ownership of daily operations. "You taught me everything about building," he'd said when we signed the papers. "Now I need you to help me build something bigger." At the time, I thought it was just his way of honoring the old man. Now I understand it was something much deeper. The funeral took place on a crisp morning in October. The cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking Denver, the wind rustling through rows of aspen trees already turning gold. I stood there with my hands clasped together, my back more bent than I'd realized. People came up one by one, shaking my hand, saying the things people always say at funerals. "He's in a better place now. At least he's not suffering anymore." I nodded out of habit. I couldn't really hear them. My ears buzzed with that hollow sound grief makes. Linda stood a short distance away. She was dressed head to toe in black, a perfectly fitted dress, hair pulled back in a neat bun, makeup flawless without a single smudge. I tried to find even a hint of sorrow in her eyes, redness around the edges, a trembling lip. Nothing. She looked like she was attending a business conference, not burying her husband. During the service, I watched her check her phone twice. While the pastor spoke about Carl's legacy of building homes and communities, Linda was reading text messages. When they asked if anyone wanted to share a memory, she remained silent. I talked about teaching Carl to swing a hammer, about watching him grow from a curious boy into a man who built things that lasted. Linda stared at her manicured nails. When it was over, people left one by one. I thought I would stay a while in that house, the place I'd lived in for half a year, where the smell of Carl's aftershave still lingered in the bathroom, where his favorite coffee mug still sat by the kitchen window. I needed a few hours. I thought I had the right to that much. But Linda didn't allow it. She walked into the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing in the silence. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't say a word about Carl or offer any comfort. She stood a few steps away, crossed her arms, and delivered those words that still make my spine go cold when I recall them. "You have no rights here anymore." The way she emphasized "you" made my position clear. I wasn't family, I wasn't anyone, just a burden that had outlived its use. She continued, her tone flat and professional, as if reading from a script she'd rehearsed. "The will has been read. The lawyer confirmed it. Every asset belongs to me. Carl's construction company is now valued at $6 million. This house, with its mountain views and 3-car garage, is mine too. You're just a guest here," she said, "and I want you gone now." I stared at her for a long moment, not, though, because I didn't understand, but because I was trying to accept that the woman standing before me, the woman I'd treated like a daughter for 8 years, could say something like that only hours after burying her husband. The woman Carl had brought home for Christmas dinner, nervous and excited. "Dad, I want you to meet Linda. She's special." I'd welcomed her, included her in family traditions, shared stories about Carl's childhood. I thought of Carl, of the nights he gripped my hand, voice tight from pain, asking me to read a few pages from his old engineering textbooks just to distract him, of the way his face would tense every time Linda walked into the room, only to soften into a forced smile. I'd seen those things. I just chose silence. I thought it was their marriage, not my place. Now I knew some silences come at a very high cost. Linda stepped closer, placed a hand on my chest, and gave a light push. Not hard, not violent, but enough to make me step back half a pace. It was just the right amount of pressure to remind me she held all the power now, a gesture that said I no longer belonged. I didn't speak. I bent down, picked up my car keys from the coffee table. My 12-year-old pickup truck was parked in the driveway. It was the only thing still mine at that moment. My wallet was in the guest room. My documents, my phone, everything that proved who I was remained inside the house I was no longer allowed to enter. I walked outside. The heavy door closed behind me with a solid thud. I stood on the front porch, the mountain air carrying a chill that cut through my funeral suit. I shoved my hands into my pockets and felt only my car keys and an old handkerchief. And in that moment, in the middle of shock and emptiness, one memory rose vividly. Carl on his hospital bed in the living room, his eyes sharper than they had been in months, his voice weak but steady. "Dad, you have to promise me one thing." He gripped my hand tightly. "No matter what Linda does after I'm gone, don't react, don't argue, don't sue, don't try to take anything back immediately. Just let it happen." I had promised then just to give him peace. I hadn't understood why he asked. I thought he was worried about family fighting over money. Now, standing outside that house with nothing but the clothes on my back, I began to understand that Carl hadn't spoken in confusion. My son never did anything without purpose. He was a builder, a man who believed in structure, in foundations, in putting every piece exactly where it belonged so nothing could collapse. Even as a teenager, Carl would spend hours on construction sites with me during summers, asking questions about load-bearing walls and why we use certain materials in specific places. "Everything has to be planned, Dad. You can't just hope it holds together." I walked down the stone steps slowly, as if moving too fast would cause everything to fall apart. The path to the street seemed endless, lined with Linda's, perfectly manicured flower beds and solar pathway lights. Carl once joked that Linda liked everything to look like a magazine photo. Looking back now, it sounded more like a warning. My old truck sat at the curb, looking out of place among the luxury cars that had filled the driveway during the reception. I opened the door, sat behind the wheel, and rested my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. The cab smelled of work gloves and coffee, the faint dust of construction sites I'd left behind. I closed my eyes for a moment, and the memory pulled me back to those final days when Carl was still breathing in that same house. The living room had been transformed into a makeshift hospital room. Carl's adjustable bed was positioned where he could see out to the mountains. We kept the curtains open just enough to soften the harsh Colorado sunlight. An oxygen concentrator hummed beside the wall, steady as a heartbeat. On the small bedside table sat a water bottle, tissues, pain medication, and a leather notebook Carl always kept within reach. I once asked what was in it, and he only shook his head, saying I'd know when it was time. One morning, I caught a glimpse when he was writing. The pages were filled with numbers, percentages, legal terms I didn't recognize. "Dad," he'd said that day, looking up from his writing, "do you remember what you taught me about building a foundation?" "Sure, son. You dig deep, you use the right materials, and you make sure it's level." Carl smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him in weeks. "And if you do it right, it'll hold up everything you put on top of it, even when the weather gets rough." Some nights he fell asleep mid-sentence, his thin hand resting on the blanket. I sat beside him, listening to his labored breathing and the wind outside, wondering how life could be this cruel. Carl had been a strong kid, curious and inventive. He used to take apart his toys just to see how they worked, then put them back together in new ways. When he was 16, he rebuilt the engine in my old Ford pickup. Took him 3 months working every weekend. When it finally started, he looked at me with pride and said, "I want to build things that last, Dad. Important things." He'd kept that promise. His construction company specialized in affordable housing, building homes for families who thought they'd never own property. Linda was there during those months, but like a shadow that spoke when it needed something. Sometimes she'd enter the room, wearing expensive perfume, glance at the medical equipment, then ask questions that didn't belong there. "What's the meeting schedule with the accountant next week? How are the company contracts progressing? When are you signing the life insurance updates?" Carl would listen and say nothing. Sometimes he'd glance at me, and in that look was exhaustion deeper than his illness. When she left, he'd exhale quietly, like someone freed from a weight he couldn't name. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that an old man like me shouldn't insert himself into their marriage. I trusted Carl's judgment. I chose to stay quiet, to keep peace in a house already heavy with impending loss. Looking back, I realized that sometimes what we call peace is just the calm before a deliberate storm. One rainy afternoon in September, Carl called me closer. He could still speak then, his voice thin but clear. He took my hand, cold but firm, and I leaned in close. "Dad," he said, "you have to promise me something." I nodded immediately, thinking he wanted to talk about the funeral arrangements, maybe a keepsake he wanted me to have. I was ready for final instructions. But Carl didn't talk about the service. He didn't talk about burial or speeches or flowers. He talked about Linda. "No matter what Linda does, don't react," he said, each word pulled out with effort. "Don't argue. Don't fight. Don't try to fix anything right away. Just wait." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Don't worry, son. I'll be fine." Carl shook his head slightly. "Dad, listen. Promise me." I thought it was the medication talking, the fear of dying making him paranoid. I'd seen other terminal patients become suspicious of everyone around them. I wanted to reassure him, tell him everything would be fine, that Linda would take care of things properly. But Carl looked at me with eyes that held the same focus I'd seen as a boy when he stood on a chair taking apart my old radio, asking why one wire connected to another. It wasn't delirium. It was the look of someone who understood a structure before others could see how it would fall apart. "Silence isn't weakness," Carl said quietly. "Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's letting things reveal themselves." I swallowed hard. The only sounds were the machine's steady hiss and rain tapping against the window. Carl pointed weakly toward the notebook on the table. He didn't open it. He just touched the leather cover as if reminding me that everything had already been written down. "Promise me, Dad," he said again, his voice cracking. "Just do one thing. Don't react immediately. Let it happen. When the time comes, the truth will speak for itself." I wanted to ask what he meant, what he'd prepared, why he thought his wife might do something that required me to promise restraint. But Carl was fading, his forehead damp with sweat from the effort of speaking. I couldn't push him further. I leaned down and pressed my forehead gently against the back of his hand. "I promise," I said. "I promise, son, so you can rest easy." Carl closed his eyes, and in that moment, his face relaxed as if that one promise was enough for him to let go of the weight he'd been carrying. Now, sitting in my truck outside the house I'd just been expelled from, I opened my eyes to see the sun beginning to set behind the mountains. My hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the realization of what that promise truly meant. Carl had known Linda far better than I ever did. He had lived with her, seen things I didn't see or chose not to see, and he had prepared something, not with anger, not with arguments, but with what he did best, careful planning and precise execution. I placed my hand on the steering wheel and spoke softly into the empty cab, my voice steady, but the words carrying the weight of a second oath. "Rest easy, son. I won't break your plan." I started the engine. The old motor turned over with a familiar rumble. I drove away from the neighborhood, through the automatic gate, and onto the main road leading toward town. Houses glowed with warm lights, families eating dinner, watching TV, living ordinary Thursday evenings. I, on the other hand, felt like a man stripped of everything familiar. I had no wallet, no phone, no documents. Everything was still inside the house. I was no longer allowed to enter. I would have to call the bank in the morning, cancel cards, and start the process of rebuilding basic identification. For a moment, I thought about turning back, knocking on the door, demanding my belongings. Part of me wanted to stand up for some basic dignity. But then I remembered the promise. I remembered Carl's eyes, and I understood that if I went back now, I would be giving Linda exactly what she expected. An old man making a scene, proving her point that I was nothing but a problem. I drove to a gas station on the highway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the smell of gasoline mixing with burnt coffee from inside. I parked and stood in front of a payphone that somehow still worked, a relic from before everyone carried computers in their pockets. I reached into my coat pocket and counted loose change, enough for one short call. There was one person I trusted completely, someone who had sat with me the night my wife died 5 years ago, not offering empty platitudes, but placing a warm meal in my hands and letting me grieve without judgment. My wife's best friend, Joyce Parker. I dialed her number from memory. The ringing stretched long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then a familiar voice picked up, slightly out of breath. "Hello?" "Joyce," I said, surprised at how my voice cracked on her name. "It's me, Al." There was a pause. Then her tone changed, suddenly alert. "Al! My goodness, where are you? I've been calling your cell all afternoon. No answer. The funeral. Are you all right?" That night, Joyce took me to her modest ranch house in a quiet neighborhood where mature oak trees lined the streets. Her home wasn't large, but it was warm. The air carried the scent of Earl Grey tea and vanilla candles. Simple human comforts that reminded me I was still part of this world. She didn't press me with more questions during the drive. When we arrived, she unlocked the front door, turned on the living room lights, and handed me a mug of hot coffee. I sank into a well-worn armchair, and for the first time since leaving the hospital months ago, I felt something close to safety. Joyce told me to take the guest room. She handed me clean pajamas and said to shower and try to clear my head. I followed her instructions mechanically. The hot water ran over my shoulders, washing away the smell of the cemetery and the cold mountain air. But it couldn't wash away Linda's words. They remained with me, sharp and permanent. The next morning, Joyce brewed coffee and slid a cup toward me, then sat across the kitchen table with her arms crossed like a teacher, preparing for a difficult conversation. "Al," she said slowly, her tone calm but determined, "you said you're going to wait. I understand you want to keep your promise to Carl, but I need to know what you're waiting for. You can't just let that woman destroy everything he worked for." I set my cup down carefully, the soft clink of ceramic filling the momentary silence. I didn't tell Joyce everything about the promise. Not yet. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I still didn't fully understand it myself. "Carl wasn't confused when he made me promise that," I said. "He spoke like a man who had already solved a complex engineering problem. He knew what Linda would do, and he wanted me to stay still so she would reveal herself completely." Joyce stared at me for a long moment, as if looking at a man who had said something far too calm while his world collapsed around him. Then she sighed and picked up her smartphone. "All right," she said. "If you're going to stay quiet, then at least I'm going to keep watch. I'll monitor what she's doing." Joyce wasn't particularly tech-savvy, but she had the persistence of a retired elementary school teacher who dealt with every type of parent and excuse. She opened her laptop and typed in Linda's name. Within minutes, Linda's social media profiles appeared on the screen. The photo showed her tilting her head slightly, blonde hair cascading. Over one shoulder, eyes gazing into the distance like a woman stepping into a bright new future. Joyce made a disgusted sound. "She's got professional photos taken already," Joyce muttered. "Probably has a whole team managing her image now." I said nothing. I just watched the screen, hoping against logic to see some post about Carl. Something about loss, grief, memories. I know it sounds naive, but part of me still hoped she might at least pretend to mourn publicly. What I saw instead felt like being slapped while I was already down. The newest post was a photo of Linda standing beside a bright red convertible, sleek and shiny, the kind of car you buy to make a statement. She wore a short white dress and designer sunglasses, holding champagne, smiling like someone who'd just won the lottery. The caption hit like a physical blow. "New chapter starts now. Freedom and success taste sweeter than I ever imagined." I heard Joyce curse under her breath, sharp and bitter. She turned toward me, expecting me to explode, but I didn't. I just felt a cold stillness spreading down my spine. Strangely, I wasn't even shocked anymore. The worst betrayal had already happened yesterday on that front porch. This was just confirmation. Linda wasn't grieving. She was celebrating. Joyce scrolled down. More posts appeared like a series of fireworks set off in a funeral home. A party by the pool. A long table covered with white cloth and expensive wine. String lights hanging across the deck. Faces I didn't recognize. Young men in designer shirts. Women laughing and holding phones up to capture every moment. Linda stood in the center of it all, the queen of her new kingdom. Another photo showed the corner of the living room where Carl's hospital bed had been. Now it held a new white leather couch, decorative pillows, and a bottle of champagne sitting on the coffee table like a declaration of victory. I remembered that exact spot. The last good morning, Carl had enough. Strength to smile when early sunlight came through the windows. Seeing it transformed into a stage for parties drove a nail of pain deep into my chest. But the pain didn't explode into rage. It settled quietly inside me, cold and patient. Joyce moved to another post. Linda had uploaded a video story, the camera sweeping across Carl's old home office, the dark wooden shelves lined with his engineering books, rolled blueprints, the desk where he'd built his first business plan. Over the video, a caption read, "Estate sale this weekend. Everything must go," Joyce gasped. Oh my God. She clicked deeper into Linda's profile. Within an hour, we found an online marketplace listing. Linda had posted a detailed catalog of items for sale. The desk, the leather chair, the computer, even personal things. I spotted the steel watch Carl used to wear when he first started the construction company. I'd given it to him to celebrate his first major contract. He'd kept it as a symbol of what we'd built together. Now, it sat on a list with a cold price tag beside it. Joyce looked at me, waiting for a reaction. I exhaled slowly and evenly. "She's selling memories," Joyce said, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger. "She's selling Carl like she's clearing out a storage unit." I nodded. "Yeah. You're not angry?" she asked, disbelief edging her tone. I looked directly at her. "I'm furious," I said quietly, "but I won't let anger drive the truck." The days that followed passed in a strange rhythm. I stayed in Joyce's guest room, waking early, walking around the quiet neighborhood, then sitting at her kitchen table, reading newspapers. Joyce played watchdog, checking every evening to update me on Linda's latest moves. "She bought another car today," Joyce said one evening, sarcasm thick in her voice. "That thing probably costs more than most people make in a year." "Another party tonight," she reported another time. "There's a DJ, flashing lights. That house has become a nightclub." "She posted photos with some young guy," Joyce said later, slamming her hand on the table. "How long has it been since the funeral? Carl's not even cold in the ground." I listened the way an engineer listens to stress reports on a structure, not to feel vindicated, but to understand how the foundation was bearing the load. Linda was spending money fast, as if those numbers were water flowing endlessly from a tap. But each day I began to see something more clearly. She was performing wealth, and people who perform wealth without understanding its source rarely survive when the performance ends. I'd spent my adult life working with budgets and cash flow. I knew the difference between assets on paper and money in the bank. Carl's construction company had been valued at $6 million, but that number wasn't a pile of cash in a vault. It was equipment, contracts, real estate, and reputation. Things you could only turn into spending money through careful management and legal processes. 2 weeks later, at exactly 11:47 on a Thursday night, my prediction came true. Joyce and I were sitting in her living room when her landline phone rang. Nobody called the landline at that hour unless it was an emergency. Joyce answered cautiously. "Hello?" Even from across the room, I could hear the sharp, desperate edge in the voice coming through the receiver. I recognized it immediately. Linda, but not the composed Linda from the funeral, or the triumphant Linda from social media. This was Linda backed into a corner. Joyce mouthed the name silently and held the phone toward me. I walked over and took it. "Hello?" I said calmly. "Al." Linda's voice cracked on my name. Gone was the cold authority from that day she threw me out. Now there was panic, raw and unconcealed. "Al, I need your help. Something's wrong. The lawyers are saying... They're saying there's a problem with the business." I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, not to torture her, but to... Listen, in construction, you learn to hear when a structure starts to fail. The sound changes before the collapse. "Are you there?" Linda asked frantically. "I'm here." "I tried to access the company accounts," she said, words tumbling out in a rush. "I need to transfer funds, but they're telling me I can't. They're saying something about partnership agreements and voting rights. I don't understand. Carl owned that company. I inherited everything." I closed my eyes briefly. There it was, the small thing that seemed insignificant until you needed it. Carl had been brilliant. "What exactly are they telling you?" I asked. "They're saying—" Linda's voice broke. "They're saying you have control, that you're listed as a business partner with majority voting rights. That can't be right. You were just—" She didn't finish the sentence, but I heard what she meant to say. "You're just an old man I threw out of the house." "The partnership agreement is legal," I said, quietly, a sharp intake of breath. "What partnership agreement?" "The one I signed when I invested $600,000 in Mitchell Construction 8 months ago," I said. "The one that gave me 60% voting control in exchange for the capital injection Carl needed to expand. It's not about ownership percentage, it's about decision-making authority." The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought she'd hung up. Then came a sound I'd never heard from Linda before, the choking sob of someone realizing they'd walked into a trap they'd built for themselves. "If you want to discuss this properly," I said, "we can meet with the attorneys tomorrow morning. Bring your lawyer." The next morning, Joyce drove me to the law offices of Stevens and Associates. At exactly 10 a.m., Linda arrived with a young man in an ill-fitting suit. When she saw me, she looked like someone who'd been hoping this was all a bad dream. Carol Stevens, the estate attorney, laid out the facts cleanly. Linda owned 40% of the business assets but had no voting control. I could buy out her share for $240,000, 40% of the company's value minus her debts, her spending spree, and legal costs. Linda signed the papers with a trembling hand. When she finished, she looked at me one last time. "I thought I had everything," she whispered. "You had a choice," I replied. "We all did." A month later, I stood in the home office where Carl had spent his final months, looking out at the mountains he'd loved. The house was quiet now, peaceful. Linda had moved out within the week, taking her $240,000 and disappearing from our lives. I'd kept my promise to Carl, but more than that, I'd discovered what he'd really built. Not just a legal structure to protect assets, but a test of character, a way to separate people who cared about family from people who only cared about themselves. The construction company was thriving under new management. I'd hired Carl's most trusted employees to run daily operations while I focused on the foundation we'd established, the Carl Mitchell Cancer Support Fund, helping families navigate the financial burdens that come with fighting the disease that took my son. I moved into a smaller house near the mountains. Nothing fancy, just peaceful. In the mornings, I walk. In the afternoons, I read. Sometimes I sit on the front porch and listen to the wind through the pines. I still think of Carl every day. The pain of losing a child never disappears. It just changes shape, becoming part of your internal structure, like a support beam that keeps you standing. I kept my promise to him. I didn't destroy what he'd built by reacting with anger. I stayed quiet long enough for the truth to speak for itself. And I learned something I never thought I'd learn at 62 years old. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is nothing at all. Linda taught me that silence isn't weakness. Silence is the space where truth can stand up and be recognized for what it really is. When you're facing betrayal, your first instinct might be to fight back immediately. But sometimes the most powerful response is patience, letting people reveal who they truly are before you decide how to respond. The people who underestimate quiet wisdom usually discover their mistake when it's too late to fix it.